My father stood in front of 200 people and handed my brother a check for $1 million. Then he turned to me and told me to go earn my own. Before I tell you what happened next, take 1 second to hit subscribe, because what I'm about to share with you is the kind of story that reminds us the quiet ones are often the ones building something nobody can see yet. My name is Nora Hayes. I was 31 years old on the night my family decided, without a single vote, that I didn't matter. And 12 months later, a lawyer slid an envelope across a table that made my father scream like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. This is that story. The hall smelled like sawdust and rented folding chairs. Outside, the parking lot was full of pickup trucks with the Hayes Lumber and Supply logo peeling off their doors. Inside, someone had hung a banner that said "Congratulations, Dean," in gold letters, the kind you buy in a party supply aisle for $30 and never reuse. It was my brother Dean's big night. My father, Richard Hayes, had called the whole family together. Aunts, uncles, half the men from the lumber yard who'd come straight from a shift, still smelling faintly of pine and diesel, to celebrate Dean's new beginning. My father stood at the front of the room holding a check. A real one. Printed big enough that even the people in the back row could read the number. $1 million. Dean took it the way he took everything in his life, like it had always been waiting for him. He laughed, hugged our mother, said something about vision and disruption that made half the room nod along like they understood it. Maybe they did. I didn't, and I had a CPA license. The room clapped like he'd just landed on the moon. I clapped too. I want to be honest about that. I clapped, because that's what you do, and because some small, stupid part of me still thought maybe, there was something coming for me too. A smaller check. A kind word. Anything. Then my father found me by the dessert table. He wasn't cruel. That's the part that still gets me. Even now, he was calm. Gentle, almost. Like he was doing me a favor. Like he'd thought about this moment and decided this was the kindest way to deliver it. Go earn your own, he said. That was it. 4 words. Said the way you'd tell someone the weather was turning, or that the roast needed another 20 minutes. The room didn't even flinch. My mother smiled into her wine glass. My aunt squeezed my arm and told me how proud they were of my brother, as if I'd asked, as if that had anything to do with what had just been said to me. I stood there holding a paper plate with a slice of carrot cake on it, and I smiled, and I said thank you, because 31 years of practice had taught me exactly how to do that. At the far end of the hall sat my grandfather, Earl Hayes, 81 years old. The man who built our family's lumber business out of one broken-down truck and a bad knee back in 1968. When Dean took that check, the whole room erupted into applause. Grandpa Earl didn't move his hands. Not an inch. He sat there with his fingers laced together on the table in front of him, and he looked at me. Not at Dean. Not at the check. At me. I noticed. I think he wanted me to notice. I just didn't understand yet what that meant. I didn't cry that night. I know people expect tears at this point in the story, but that's not who I am. I drove home with the radio off, because I needed the silence to think, and because every song on every station that night seemed to be about someone leaving someone else, and I wasn't in the mood for the universe's sense of humor. I went home. I made coffee, the cheap kind, the kind I'd been buying since I started squirreling away money for an apartment of my own. I opened a brand new notebook, the cover still smelling like the office supply store, and on the very first page, I wrote one word. Start. I sat there for a long time looking at that one word. I didn't know what I was starting. I just knew. I was done waiting for someone to pick me. The next morning, I drove out to the lumber yard. I told myself I was just dropping off some paperwork, the quarterly numbers, a folder I genuinely did have in my passenger seat. That was a lie I let myself believe for about 10 minutes, which is roughly how long the drive took. The truth was, I needed to see my grandfather. He was already there, like always, because Earl, was a man who treated sunrise as a personal challenge. That same chipped blue mug sat on the counter where it had sat for as long as I could remember, the enamel worn down to bare metal on the handle from 60 years of the same grip. He poured me a coffee I never asked for and slid it across without a word. The coffee was terrible. It was always terrible. I drank it anyway. I told him everything. The check. The sentence. Go earn your own. I told him about the applause, and about my mother smiling into her wine, and about the way nobody in that room had so much as blinked. He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't say that's not fair. He looked at me over that old mug and asked one question. So, what's the plan? Not are you okay? Not that's not right. What he did. What's the plan? I started to say I didn't have one, and then I stopped, because I did. I'd written it down the night before, in one word, but underneath that one word was an entire half-formed idea I'd been turning over for years without ever saying out loud. There's all these little shops in town, I said slowly, almost embarrassed to hear myself say it out loud for the first time. Guys like Sam at the auto shop, Carol at the bakery, people who are good at what they do, but their books are a mess, and the bank won't talk to them, and they're one bad month away from losing everything. I've been doing that, for free, for this family, since I was 19. He listened. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his mug slowly on the counter, leaving a faint ring of condensation that he'd wipe away later with the same gray rag he always used. Then he said something I would carry like a stone in my chest for the next 12 months. I'm not betting on the loud one, he said quietly. I'm betting on the one who shows up. Outside, the first rain of the day started ticking against the tin roof of the office, a sound I would come to know better than my own heartbeat by the end of that year. Come back tomorrow, he said. I want to show you the old books. I asked him why. He just smiled, that small, private smile he had, and went back to his ledger. I didn't push. I should have. But I didn't. Here's what you need to understand about my family, and about this town. My grandfather built Hayes Lumber and Supply from nothing. One flatbed truck, in 1968, and a bad knee from the war that never fully healed and never once slowed him down. By the time I was born, that yard was the place every contractor, every weekend handyman, every widow with a leaking roof came through. It put roofs over half the houses in Brindle. Literally. I've stood on some of those roofs. My father had run it for 15 years. And he ran it well. I want to be fair to him, because this story doesn't work if I pretend he was a cartoon villain. He kept the lights on. He kept people employed. But he'd never built it. He'd inherited it. And I think that gap, between building something and being handed something, lived inside my father like a splinter he could never quite dig out. It showed up in small ways. The way he talked about the business in front of other men, always with a little too much emphasis on my father's company early in a conversation and my company by the end of it. The way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever someone at the hardware trade shows asked him how Earl was doing, like the question itself was a small accusation. So he overcompensated. He took out a massive loan to build a second warehouse on the edge of town, a glass-fronted, steel-frame thing that looked more like a car dealership than a lumber yard. And he talked about it at every single family dinner like it was already a legacy, like people would be telling stories about Richard Hayes's warehouse for generations. And then he handed his son $1 million, in front of 200 witnesses, to prove the family still produced winners. Meanwhile, nobody, not one person in that rented hall, mentioned the daughter quietly balancing the books in the back office. The one who'd caught an $8,000 billing error from a vendor at age 19 and gotten, in her own mother's words, "That's nice, sweetheart," and a pat on the shoulder. I wasn't angry about being invisible. Here's the thing nobody tells you about being invisible. Invisible people see everything. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork for my grandfather, boxes and boxes of it, decades of receipts and invoices that nobody had touched since the filing cabinets were last reorganized sometime during the Clinton administration, I found the loan documents for that new warehouse. I read them slowly, twice. The way I read everything that matters. My father hadn't just borrowed against the business. He had borrowed against money he expected to inherit from his own father someday. Money nobody had promised him in writing. Money that, legally, technically, in every way that mattered, wasn't his. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I sat there in that dusty back office with the loan paperwork in my lap, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, exactly. More like recognition. Like seeing the outline of a crack in a wall you'd always assumed was solid. I didn't say a word. I just filed it away. In the cabinet. And in my mind, in a drawer I didn't open again for almost a year. My first real client came to me almost by accident, though I've come to believe very little in this story was actually an accident. His name was Sam Coleman. He ran a tiny auto repair shop on Main Street, the kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a dog that slept in the doorway and a radio permanently tuned to a classic rock station. The kind of place that fixes your car and listens to your problems in the same breath, free of charge, whether you want either service or not. He was drowning. 3 vendors he owed money to, all calling at once. His books were, and I mean this literally, a showbox, an actual cardboard showbox, Nike, size 11, full of receipts in no particular order. And the bank had stopped picking up his calls weeks ago. Someone, I never found out who, and I like that I never found out, told him the Hayes girl is good with numbers. He called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear in his voice that he was bracing for me to talk down to him. Bracing for a lecture. I didn't have money to give him. I want to be clear about that, because this is usually the part of the story where a rich relative swoops in with a check and saves the day. There was no rich relative. There was just me, my own kitchen table, and a notebook. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I went through every single number in that showbox, one receipt at a time, until 2 in the morning. I restructured his debt. I found him a small line of credit at a credit union 2 towns over that still believed in handshakes, and I contact more than credit scores. I called 2 of his vendors myself and renegotiated their contracts down to something a human being could actually afford on a mechanic's income. When I was done, I charged him a modest fee, a fraction of what an accounting firm would have charged, and I wrote up a real agreement. Signed. Dated. So we both knew exactly where we stood, with no ambiguity for either of us to hide behind later. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with the showbox empty and a stack of organized folders in its place, I wrote a name across the top of a new manila folder. Hayes Ventures. It wasn't a company yet. It wasn't a fund. It wasn't anything you could point to. It was a name, and a promise to keep the books clean. While I was rebuilding Sam Coleman's showbox of receipts, my brother was throwing a launch party. Dean leased an office downtown, exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of reclaimed wood conference table that costs more than most people's cars. The kind of place that costs more to look successful in than it does to actually be successful. He hired a friend to design a logo, another friend to run social media, whatever that meant for a company that didn't have a product yet. A third friend whose actual job title nobody, including Dean, could ever fully explain to me, even months later. There was a bar at the launch party. An open bar, on a Tuesday, for a business that hadn't made a single dollar. My parents came, of course. My mother wore a new dress and told everyone, including the caterer, that her son was an entrepreneur, with the kind of emphasis people usually reserve for words like doctor or senator. My father stood by the big windows with his arms crossed, looking out at the city lights, proud the way men are proud of things they've purchased. I went, because not going would have made a statement, and I wasn't ready to make statements yet. I stood near the back of the room with a glass of sparkling water I never finished, and I watched the money move in the wrong direction, out, in every direction, toward catering and lighting rentals and a string quartet that nobody had requested and everybody was too polite to ask about. At one point, an investor Dean had been courting all night, a tall man in an expensive but understated suit, the kind of suit that whispers money instead of shouting it, drifted over to where I was standing. He mistook me for one of the staff, which, in fairness, given how I was dressed compared to everyone else there, was a reasonable mistake. He asked me a real question. About margins. About the unit economics of whatever Dean was supposedly building. I answered it. Honestly. Simply. The way I'd answer any question about numbers, because numbers don't care who's asking. He asked another question. And then another. We ended up talking for almost 10 minutes, about overhead, about runway, about the difference between revenue and recurring revenue, while my brother watched from across the room, his smile getting tighter and tighter with every passing minute. When the investor finally left, he shook my hand. Not Dean's. Dean found me by the coat check before I left. He was still smiling, for the room, for anyone watching, but his eyes weren't. "You don't have to lurk at my party doing math," he said, low enough that only I could hear it. "I'm not lurking," I told him. "I'm learning." If you've ever stood in a room while your family poured everything, money, attention, hope, into the loud one, while you quietly built something real in the corner that nobody was watching, you already know exactly how that conversation felt. Stick with me. It gets better, and it gets earned. If you haven't yet, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, so the next chapter finds you. The whispers started about a month later. Soft ones. The worst kind. Word got around the family that I was bitter. That I'd started some little side project out of jealousy. That I was, in my Aunt Patricia's memorable phrase, relayed to me secondhand, of course, because nobody ever said these things to my face, trying to make Dean look bad. I knew exactly where that story came from. My brother had always been good at telling stories. It was, in fact, the one skill I'd watched him develop with genuine dedication over the years. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon. She didn't ask how my work was going. She asked me, in the gentle, conflict-averse voice she used for things she found genuinely uncomfortable, to please not make things awkward at the next family dinner. I sat on my couch holding the phone, looking at my own ceiling, and I thought about how I was being asked not to be the embarrassment, in a family that had handed a grown man $1 million to throw parties with a string quartet. I didn't fight it. I want to underline that, because fighting it would have been the trap. If I'd argued, I would have become exactly the bitter daughter they'd already quietly decided I was. Arguing would have been proof. So I stayed quiet. I kept working. And I let the only argument I ever trusted make itself. One of my aunts, Aunt Linda, who ran a small bakery on the south side of town, and who had been one of the loudest voices in the Grace is Just Jealous chorus, though she didn't know I knew that, called me in October. Her bakery's books had fallen apart. Half hoping, I think, that I'd say no, that I'd be too bitter to help her, which would have confirmed everything she'd been saying about me to anyone who'd listen. I didn't say no. I drove over that same week, sat at her kitchen table surrounded by the smell of cinnamon and burnt sugar, and went through 8 months of statements. I found $4,000 she'd been losing, slowly, invisibly, a few dollars at a time, to a payment processor that was charging her fees nobody had ever explained to her, buried in fine print 3 pages deep in a contract she'd signed without reading. I fixed it. I never once brought up the things she'd said about me. I didn't need to. She did the math on her own, sitting there at that table, watching $4,000 reappear in her cash flow like it had been hiding behind the refrigerator the whole time. The next time the family gathered, Thanksgiving, as it happened, she sat next to me. Not near me. Next to me, at the good end of the table, in the seat that used to be reserved for whoever Dean had decided was interesting that week. People notice who shows up when the cameras are off. I let myself say one thing to her, quietly, while everyone else was arguing about football. The only line I ever allowed myself in that entire year. "You can believe what's loud," I told her, "or you can read what's written. I'll be over here writing." By midsummer, I had 6 clients. Then 8. Hayes Ventures stopped being a name on a folder and started being a small, stubborn little engine, running quietly in the background of this town's economy. The pattern was always the same. Find a struggling shop. Clean the books, actually clean them, not just rearrange the mess into a nicer looking mess. Connect the owner with people who trusted my word, the credit union, the right vendor, sometimes just another shop owner who'd been through the same thing 2 years earlier and could offer advice for free. Take a fair cut when things worked out. Put that cut right back into the next shop. Do it again. I wasn't getting rich. I want to be honest about the math, because this isn't a story about a secret fortune. I was getting real. It cost me everything else, though. I was at my day job, the accounting firm 2 towns over, by 7 in the morning. My own clients, the Hayes Ventures clients, got my evenings, sometimes until 10 or 11 at night. I fell asleep more nights than I'd like to admit with my laptop still open on my chest and the lamp still on. I didn't date. I barely saw friends. That was my flaw. If I have one in this story, I carried everything alone, and I let almost no one close enough to help carry it with me. It made me good at the work. It made me lonely in the world. Both of those things were true at the same time, for a very long time. Most evenings, even when I didn't need to, I'd swing by the yard with a folder for my grandfather. Sometimes it was real business, the quarterly numbers, an invoice that needed his signature. Sometimes it was just an excuse to sit in that office for 20 minutes and drink terrible coffee. He started asking me questions that went deeper than small talk. How did I structure the small deals? Was it a loan, an investment, something else? What happened if a client's shop folded? Who absorbed the loss? Who held the paper? Did I have it all written down somewhere? Or was it mostly an understanding? He asked the way a man asks when he's quietly building a plan of his own, and doesn't want you to notice his taking notes. One night, with rain ticking softly against the tin roof above us, a sound that, by now, I associated almost entirely with this office, with this man, with this particular kind of quiet, he asked me to write the whole thing down for him. The entire structure of how Hayes Ventures actually worked. The agreements, the terms, the way I documented everything. I'm just curious how a smart person does it, he said, which was, I would later realize, both completely true and not even close to the whole truth. I made him a clean, one-page summary that weekend, simple language, the way he liked things, no jargon. I handed it over without thinking twice. I should have asked him why he wanted it. I was too tired, and honestly, too proud of having something worth summarizing, to wonder what my 81-year-old grandfather was quietly building of his own, 3 steps ahead of all of us. My father heard, eventually, that I was doing well. Word travels fast in a town this size, even when you're not trying to make noise. And it landed on him like an accusation. He didn't congratulate me. He summoned me. That's really the only word for it. A text message. Come by the house Sunday. Need to talk. No question mark. Not really a request. I drove to the house on a Sunday afternoon and found him in his study, the door already half closed when I arrived, a positioning he'd been using on me since I was a teenager, the half-closed door that said I was already in the middle of something more important than you, but I'll make an exception. He got straight to the point, which, to his credit, was at least efficient. I'm hearing your name around town, he said, not looking up from whatever he was pretending to read. Attached to other people's money. People are starting to say Hayes like it's your thing. It is my thing, I said. It's not, he said, and now he did look up. The name belongs to the business. My business. I'd appreciate it if you found something else to call your little operation. He framed it as protecting the family name. We both knew it was a test. He wanted to see whether I'd fold the way I always had, whether I'd quietly trade away something I'd built for the small, cold currency of his approval. I sat there for a moment. I thought about every year I'd kept his books for free, starting at 19, never once asked, never once thanked. I thought about that check, printed large enough to read from the back row, and the 4 words that came after it. You told me to earn my own, I said. My voice didn't shake. I'd practiced not letting it shake, somewhere in the back of my mind, for months without realizing it. I'm earning it. His jaw worked, the muscle at the corner of it tightening and releasing, the way it did right before he raised his voice, except he didn't raise his voice this time. He just got quieter. You'll regret being difficult about this, he said. I already filed the business name with the state, I told him. Months ago. Properly. It's done. That part was true, and it was the part that mattered. He could be angry. He could sit in that study and be as angry as he wanted, for as long as he wanted. He couldn't undo a filing. I left before either of us said something we couldn't take back. Driving home, I realized something. The name had become the whole fight. Which meant the name had become important. Which meant, and I felt this settle into place with a kind of quiet finality, I would never give it up. Not now. Not ever. He'd told me to earn my own. He just hadn't expected me to keep the family name while I did it. By fall, my brother's $1 million had started to disappear. I didn't gloat. I barely noticed. I was too busy, until he made absolutely sure I noticed. He called me on a Thursday evening. I almost didn't pick up. I was in the middle of a client's year-end reconciliation. But something in the missed call notification, 3 calls in 4 minutes made me call back. "Hey," he said, and his voice had a quality I'd never heard from him before. Careful. Almost, and this was the strange part, almost respectful. "Could you look at something for me?" "The books." "My books." For the first time in our entire lives, my brother needed something I had. I went over the next day. I owed myself that much, to see it with my own eyes, rather than hear about it secondhand the way everything else in this family seemed to travel. The exposed brick office still looked impressive from the street. Inside, it felt like a stage set after the show has closed. 2 of his friend partners had quietly stopped showing up weeks ago. The big investor, the one who'd shaken my hand at the launch, had walked away entirely, no explanation, just stopped returning calls. I sat down at that reclaimed wood conference table with his laptop and went through it. It took less than an hour, because there wasn't much to go through. Of the $1 million our father had handed him, printed large enough to read from the back row, maybe a quarter remained. And it was draining every single week. Rent. Salaries for the friends. A marketing contract that, as far as I could tell, had produced exactly 1 billboard on the highway and nothing else. He hadn't built a business. He'd built a stage. A very expensive, very temporary stage. I told him the truth. Plainly. The same way I told Sam Coleman the truth a year earlier, sitting across from his showbox of receipts. No judgment in my voice, just numbers, because numbers don't care who's listening. I showed him exactly where the money had gone. I showed him what cutting costs now, immediately, brutally, could still save. Then he asked the real question. The one he'd actually called for. What if? He paused, and I watched him choose his words the way you choose a path across thin ice. What if Hayes Ventures put some money in? As, like, a bridge. You'd be an investor. In my company. I looked at my brother. The one who'd been handed $1 million head start, in front of 200 people, with applause. The one with a quarter of it left. Asking the sister who'd started with a notebook and a showbox to plug the hole. "No," I said. Not cruelly. Just clearly, the way I say everything. I don't pour clean money into a story. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, and looked out the big glass windows at the street below. He never told our parents he'd asked me. He let them keep believing the launch was thriving, that the billboard was phase 1, that the friends were the founding team, that everything was on track. I let him keep that secret too. It wasn't mine to spend. That same season, my grandfather started to slow down. It was small at first, the kind of small that you notice and then immediately talk yourself out of noticing, because the alternative is too big to look at directly. He'd arrive at the yard a little later each morning, leave a little earlier each afternoon. Once, in the middle of a sentence about a delivery schedule, he just stopped, sat there for a second with his mouth slightly open, like a record skipping, then found his place again, with a small, almost embarrassed frown, and kept going as if nothing had happened. I started staying later. Not for any reason I could have explained out loud. One gray afternoon, the sky the color of an old nickel, rain coming down steady on that tin roof, I found him sitting in the dark office. He hadn't turned the lights on. The blue mug was in his hands, but it was cold, I could tell from across the room. He waved me into the other chair. He didn't want help. He wanted to talk. He told me the story of how he started the yard. A story I'd heard, conservatively, 100 times. The one truck. The bad knee. The first winter, when he'd nearly lost everything to a bad debt and a worse storm, and how 2 men from the mill, men whose names he still remembered, 60 years later, had shown up with their own trucks and helped him dig out. No questions asked, no invoice sent. But this time, he told it differently. He lingered on the part about the men who'd helped him. He said their names slowly, like he was making sure I'd remember them too, now that he might not be around to say them. And then he told me what scared him most. Not the storm. Not the debt. Not even the war. Or the knee. Watching what an easy inheritance does to a person, he said quietly, turning the cold mug in his hands. Money you didn't earn. It can rot a man from the inside. Slow. You don't see it happening. Nobody does. Until one day you do, and it's already done. He didn't say my father's name. He didn't have to. The rain filled in the silence where the name would have gone. Then he said something that didn't fit the moment at all, and I almost missed it. The way you almost miss the one important sentence in a long conversation because it's said so quietly. I've been getting my papers in order. I asked him what papers. He just smiled, the small, private smile, the one I'd seen across that rented hall a year ago, and changed the subject to the weather. Said it looked like the rain might turn to sleet by morning. Asked if I'd checked my tires. I drove home that night with a strange, uneasy feeling sitting low in my chest, the kind I couldn't name and didn't try very hard to. I told myself old men talk about papers sometimes. I told myself a lot of comfortable things, one after another, the whole drive home, like stacking sandbags against a flood I refused to believe was coming. What I didn't do was push him. I let an 81-year-old man keep his secrets, because I loved him, and because I had 3 client calls scheduled for the next morning, and because some part of me, the part that had spent 31 years learning not to ask for too much, didn't want to be the one to make him say something he wasn't ready to say. I'd understand the cost of that soon enough. A week later, my grandfather called me out to the yard for what he said was a business matter. I assumed he wanted his quarterly summary. It was about that time of year. When I arrived, Sam Coleman was already standing by the counter, hat in his hands. Looking, I thought, a little nervous. The way people look when they've been asked to do something important and aren't entirely sure what it is yet. My grandfather had the blue mug in one hand, and a single sheet of paper in the other. The office smelled like it always did, cut pine, machine oil, the particular dust that lumber yards seem to manufacture on their own. He set the paper down on the counter between us and told me to read it. It was a term sheet. 1 page. Plain language, the way he liked things. No fine print, no clauses designed to be misunderstood. Earl Hayes wishes to invest $40,000 into Hayes Ventures. A real investment. Terms. A return, modest and clearly stated. A signature line. 3 of them, actually. I looked up at him. For once in my life, I had absolutely nothing clever to say. Why a witness? I asked, glancing at Sam, who shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Because something this important, my grandfather said, should never just be somebody's word. Even mine. He signed first. His hand was slower than it used to be. I could see that, the way the pen hesitated slightly at the curves of the letters, but it was steady on the line. Steady enough that nobody, ever, looking at that signature, could say it belonged to a man who didn't know what he was doing. I signed beneath him. Sam signed beneath both of us, and dated it carefully, the way you'd expect from a man who'd learned the hard way what happens when paperwork is sloppy. My grandfather slid my copy across the counter toward me and kept his own, folding it once and tucking it into his shirt pocket, the same pocket where he kept the small notebook he used for inventory counts. Then he said the line. The one I'd carried in my chest for a year, with something new added to the end. I'm not betting on the loud one. He paused, and for just a second, his eyes weren't tired at all. I'm betting on the one who shows up. Another pause. Now it's in writing. I folded that single page and held it against my chest, in my bag, like it was worth more than $40,000. It was. I just didn't know yet how much more. Or what that ordinary piece of paper would prove, in a room I hadn't walked into yet, in front of people who hadn't yet learned to take me seriously. That $40,000 didn't change my life. Not really. I was still at the accounting firm by 7. Still falling asleep with my laptop open. But it changed Sam Coleman's life. With real capital behind Hayes Ventures, actual capital, documented, with terms, I could finally do more than just patch up debt and renegotiate contracts. I gave Sam a proper line of credit to expand. He opened a second repair bay. He hired 2 men who'd been out of work since the mill cut shifts the year before. Men whose families I'd later learn my grandfather had known by name. The same families from the story about the storm. 2 households had income again, because an old man bet on his granddaughter, and a granddaughter kept clean books. That's what that money did. It didn't buy an office with glass walls and a string quartet. It bought somebody's mortgage payment. Twice a month, on time, for the first time in over a year. One evening, Sam stopped me on my way out of the shop, wiping his hands on a rag, the radio still playing classic rock behind him, and said something I've never forgotten. "You know," he said, "your brother had $1 million. He said it carefully, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to say it, but wanted to anyway. And you've got more shops on your books than he does. With 40 grand. It's not a race," I told him. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere honest. "Everything's a race," he said. "You just don't have to tell the other guy you're running." The reckoning at the dinner table came in November. My mother hosted Thanksgiving the way she always did, the good plates, the centerpiece she'd been collecting pieces for since September, and an undercurrent of tension so familiar by now that I think we'd all stopped consciously noticing it, the way you stop noticing a hum in an old refrigerator. By then, everyone knew I was doing well. And nobody knew what to do with that information. My father chose denial, which I'd come to recognize as his default setting whenever the facts stopped cooperating with his version of events. He called my success luck. He said small shops were a phase, that real business happens at scale, gesturing vaguely with his fork as though scale was something you could point to across the table. My mother backed him up, the way she always did, without quite knowing what she was backing. Dean stayed quiet. Which, for my brother, a man who had never in his life let a silence sit unfilled if he could help it, was its own kind of confession. I didn't argue any of it. I passed the potatoes. I let them say their lines, the way you let a play run its course because interrupting it never changes the ending. Then my mother, refilling her wine glass with the particular unhurriedness of someone who'd had 2 glasses already, delivered the old verdict. The one I'd heard, in one form or another, my entire life. "Dean carries the name," she said, not even looking at me, looking instead at the centerpiece. "You just have it." She didn't even mean it as a knife anymore. That was the thing. It had been worn smooth from being said so many times, the way a stone in a river gets worn smooth, not by one blow, but by years of small, repeated contact. I let it sit. I'd gotten good at letting things sit. Later, when the table had been cleared and the men had migrated to the living room to argue about a football game none of them had actually been watching, I stepped onto the back porch for air. My mother followed me out. For one moment, just one, and I want to be precise about this because it mattered, even though it didn't last, she stopped performing. She wrapped her cardigan around herself and looked out at the dark yard, at the shapes of the trees against the orange glow of the streetlights, and she said, quietly, almost to the yard itself rather than to me, "I grew up in a house where a girl couldn't put her name on anything." A pause. Not the deed. Not the account. Nothing. My father used to say a woman's name on paper was just an invitation for someone to take it off again. It was the closest she had ever come, in 31 years, to seeing me, to acknowledging that there was a pattern here, one that had a shape, one that had started long before I was born and had simply continued, unquestioned, the way patterns do in families that don't examine themselves too closely. I waited. I think, and I've thought about this a lot since, I think I was waiting for her to finish that sentence. To say, "And I won't let that happen to you. Not in my house. Not to my daughter." She didn't. She pulled her cardigan tighter, said it was getting cold, and went back inside. Back to the living room, to the football game, to her son. That was the whole apology I would ever get from her. And it ended in the middle of a sentence, the way most things in my family did. Started, and then quietly abandoned, because finishing them would have required something nobody was willing to give. I stood out there a while longer in the cold. Then I drove home, across town, to my own apartment, to my own quiet, and I went back to work. While I was building, quietly, one client at a time, my father's big bet was starting to wobble. And I was one of the only people in this story who could see it clearly, because I was one of the only people who'd actually read the paperwork. The new warehouse had gone over budget, the way they always do, by exactly the amount that turns a smart investment into a problem we don't talk about at dinner. Dean's million was completely gone by now, which meant the family had nothing in reserve. Nothing to fall back on if the bank started asking questions. And the loan my father had taken out sat on a foundation I'd read about, months earlier, in that dusty filing cabinet. He had borrowed against an inheritance he expected to receive from his own father. Money that, on paper, in any legal sense that mattered, did not yet exist. He had spent his father's estate before his father was even gone. Now the bank, understandably, I think, looking back, wanted assurance. They wanted to see, in writing, that everything would pass to my father cleanly, the way everyone in this town simply assumed it would, the way these things always had in families like ours. So my father went to my grandfather and asked him to confirm it, to put the succession in writing, the way men do when the money's already spent and the bill is coming due. And my grandfather said nothing. He didn't refuse. He didn't agree. He just got quiet, that same quiet I'd started to recognize, the quiet that came right before he changed the subject to the weather. And my father came away from that conversation rattled in a way I had genuinely never seen before. I heard about it secondhand, from my mother, who relayed it the way you'd relay a strange dream, not quite sure what it meant but certain it meant something. I knew, in that moment, sitting at my own kitchen table going over a client's books, that my father's entire tower, the warehouse, the loan, the $1 million gesture in the rented hall, was standing on a promise nobody had ever signed. I could have done something with that information. I could have warned the bank. I could have whispered it to the right person at the right dinner party, or I could have simply sat back and waited for it to fall on its own, which, given enough time, it almost certainly would have. I didn't do any of those things. I had promised myself, at the very start of all this, sitting at my kitchen table with a fresh notebook and one word written at the top of the first page, that I would never take anything from my father. I would only build something he could never take from me. There's a difference. And it mattered to me, even when nobody else would ever know the difference existed. So I kept my head down. I kept my books clean. And I let his tower stand, or fall, on its own crooked math, in its own time. It was a bright, cold afternoon at the yard, the kind of day that smells like frost and fresh-cut pine, where the sky is so blue it looks like it was painted on. My grandfather was having a clear day. Sharp, like the old days, the kind of day where, for a few hours, you could almost convince yourself nothing had changed at all. We walked the lot together while he named different types of lumber the way other men name racehorses, running his hand along stacked boards, telling me which mill each batch had come from and why it mattered. At the end of the lot, he took me into the office. He didn't sit down. He reached into his pocket and pressed something small and metal into my hand. The key to the yard office. He closed my fingers around it, the way you'd close a child's hand around something precious and a little too big for them to hold on their own. When the rain comes through that roof, he said, nodding toward the tin ceiling, somebody who keeps good books should be the one to fix it. I laughed, a little. I'm not a roofer, Grandpa. He didn't laugh. He looked at me, steady, and said it again. Slower this time, like he needed me to hear something underneath the words, something that wasn't in the words themselves at all. Somebody, who keeps good books, should be the one to fix it. I understood, in that moment, standing in that office with the key cold in my palm, that he wasn't talking about the roof at all. I just didn't let myself fully understand it, because to understand it, I would have had to admit, out loud, even just to myself, that he was running out of clear days. So I added the key to my keyring, next to my apartment key, my car key. An ordinary key, among ordinary keys, on an ordinary ring, in an ordinary pocket. I told him I'd come back Sunday. We stood there a while longer in the cold sunlight. The blue mug sat on the counter, exactly where it always sat today. He told me he was proud of me, something he'd shown me 100 ways over the years, in coffee poured without asking, in questions about my deals, in a $40,000 term sheet with 3 signatures, but said out loud, in those exact words, maybe twice in my entire life. This was the second time. I drove home that evening lighter than I'd felt in a year. The key, cold against the others, in my pocket. Sunday never came the way I had planned. By Saturday night, the phone calls started. I was at home, going through a client's year-end numbers, when my mother called. I almost didn't pick up. I almost let it go to voicemail. The way you do with a call you assume is just going to be another conversation about Thanksgiving leftovers or whose turn it was to host Christmas. I picked up. And from the first half-second of silence on the line, before she even said a word, I knew. My grandfather had died in his sleep, after a short, Sharp illness that took him fast enough to be a mercy, and slow enough that we'd gotten to say goodbye, though none of us had known, at the time, that's what we were doing. The whole town came to the service. He had put a roof over half of their heads, in the most literal sense imaginable, and they remembered. The line for the receiving room stretched out the door and into the parking lot. Men in their work clothes standing in the cold because they hadn't had time to change, because they'd heard and come straight from the yard, from the mill, from wherever they'd been. I stood at the front and shook every hand. I accepted every casserole, every he was a good man, every if you need anything. Because that's what I do. I carry things. I made the arrangements. My father was too proud to handle the details, and my mother was too undone, genuinely, visibly undone, in a way that surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have. I wrote the obituary, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, trying to fit 60 years of one truck and a bad knee into 400 words. I chose the hymns. I picked out the suit he'd be buried in, the good one, the one he wore to weddings, not the one he wore to church, because I knew which one he actually liked better. I did it all with dry eyes. I want to be honest about that, because grief, for me, comes late, and alone, and never on anyone else's schedule. Some people might read that as cold. Let them. The one thing I let myself feel, I felt at the yard. I went out there the night after the funeral. Late, past midnight. The kind of late where the whole town feels like it belongs only to you. I let myself in with the key he'd given me, and stood in the dark office, in the smell of sawdust and cut pine and machine oil that I now understood I would smell, for the rest of my life, every single time I thought about him. His blue mug sat on the counter, exactly where it always sat today. Exactly where I'd seen it 1,000 times. I picked it up. It was, of course, empty, and cold, and had been for days. I washed it, carefully, the way you'd wash something fragile, even though it was just an old enamel mug that had survived 60 years of being banged around a lumber yard. I dried it with the same gray rag he always used. And I set it back, exactly where it belonged. And then, alone, in the dark, in the building my grandfather built from one truck in 1968, I let 1 year of held breath finally go. Just for a moment. 2 tears, maybe 3. Where no one could see it. Where no one could call it weakness, because there was no one there to call it anything at all. What I didn't see, because I was buried in arrangements, in casseroles, in obituaries, my father saw clearly. Even standing in the receiving line, between handshakes, between thank you for coming and he was a good man, I caught him. Leaning toward our family's longtime attorney, a man named Charles Whitfield who'd handled small matters for the family for decades, and asking, under his breath, in a voice he clearly thought no one else could hear, "When will the will be read? How soon can we do this?" He asked it the way a man asks about a package he's been tracking obsessively online. Impatient. Entitled to it, in his own mind, already. His own father was 3 days in the ground. And he was already counting. Grief and arithmetic, side by side, in the same man, at the same funeral. I should have understood, right then, exactly how frightened he was underneath all of it. Frightened men do the loudest things. I just didn't know yet how loud this would get. The reading was set for 2 weeks later, at the office of an attorney named Diane Mercer. Not Charles Whitfield, a name none of us recognized, which my father dismissed immediately as probably just some paperwork thing, nothing important. I had never met her before. My father had, apparently, though he didn't mention this until much later, and only in passing, the way you'd mention something you'd rather forget you'd ever done. He walked into those 2 weeks confident. More than confident, almost cheerful, in a way I hadn't seen from him since before the funeral, since maybe before the whole year had started. He'd already convinced himself how this would end. He was the only son. He ran the business. The holdings would pass to him, clean and whole, and the bank would finally exhale, and his tower, the warehouse, the loan, all of it, would hold. He had staked everything on that math. And for 2 weeks, he walked around like a man who'd already won. He even found room, in those 2 weeks, to needle me. We crossed paths at the family house. I'd gone to drop off the last of the funeral paperwork, receipts for the flowers and the catering that needed to be reimbursed from the estate account. He was in the kitchen, making coffee, And he looked at me with something close to pity. The kind of pity you feel for someone whose ship you believe has already sailed without them. After this is settled, he said, not even looking up from the coffee maker, maybe you'll finally stop playing business. Go earn your own somewhere else. Somewhere with a bit more scale. There it was again. The exact same sentence. Go earn your own. The one he'd handed me, in that rented hall, a year before, with a check for $1 million in his other hand. He said it like a man laying down a winning card. Like he was doing me a kindness, again, by reminding me of my place, again, one more time before everything got settled. I didn't take the bait. I'll see you at the reading, I said, and left. But driving home that night, I felt the entire year, every client, every late night, every signed agreement, every cold cup of coffee in that office, crystallize into a single point, sitting just ahead of me, in a lawyer's office I had never seen, where an envelope I didn't know existed was already waiting in a folder. The night before the reading, I couldn't sleep. So I did what I always do when I can't sleep. I went through my papers. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd written start on the first page of a notebook a year earlier, the same table where I'd gone through Sam Coleman's showbox at 2 a.m, with a cold cup of coffee, and I laid out the entire year in front of me. The first signed agreement with Sam Coleman, dated and witnessed. The state filing for Hayes Ventures, the one my father couldn't undo. The growing stack of client files, each one representing a shop, a family, a Friday payroll that had been made because I'd shown up. And at the bottom of the stack, the single page that meant the most. The term sheet. 3 signatures. My grandfather's hand, slow but sure, on the line. I read it again in the lamplight. The way you reread something not because you've forgotten what it says, but because you need to feel it again. $40,000. A witness. A grandfather's bet, in writing, dated months before he died. Months before he was anything but completely, unmistakably sharp. And sitting there, at 2 a.m, something settled into place in my chest. Something that steadied me for whatever was coming the next day. Whatever happened in that office tomorrow, whatever was or wasn't in that envelope, whatever my father said or screamed or threatened, I had already won the only thing I had ever actually set out to win. I had built something real. From nothing. With my own 2 hands and a set of clean books. No envelope could give me that. And no envelope, no matter what was written inside it, no matter what it said or didn't say, could ever take it away. If my grandfather had left me nothing but his old watch and a kind word in a sealed letter, the watch would have been enough. Because the believing, his believing, in writing, with a witness, months before the end, had come first. Everything else was just confirmation. I put the papers back in order, the way he'd taught me, oldest on the bottom, newest on top, everything dated, nothing loose, and I went to bed. I wasn't going to that office for an inheritance. I was going to say goodbye to the one person who had ever truly seen me. I wore the gray suit, the one I wore for client meetings, not the black one from the funeral, and drove across town under a low, wet sky that promised rain by noon. I had no idea, pulling into that parking lot, how much of that calm I'd packed the night before I was about to need. Diane Mercer's conference room was small, warm, and far too quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that you can feel pressing against your ears. My father took the head of the table without asking, the way he took most things without asking, like he'd already been handed a gavel that nobody had actually given him. My mother sat to his right, her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light every time she shifted. Dean slouched into the chair on my father's left, scrolling through his phone, doing a very good impression of someone who was bored, though I noticed he hadn't actually looked at the screen once since we'd sat down. A few aunts, including Aunt Linda, who caught my eye briefly and gave the smallest possible nod, and a great-uncle filled the remaining chairs. There to witness. There, mostly, to whisper afterward. I took a seat near the end, by the window, where I could watch the sky going from gray to grayer. Diane came in with a leather folder and a manner that gave absolutely nothing away, the kind of practiced neutrality that I recognized, professionally, as the look of someone who has done this exact thing many times and learned not to let her face telegraph what's coming. She thanked us all for being there. She offered her condolences in a voice that had clearly offered them 1,000 times before, and somehow still meant it. A skill I respected immediately, having spent a year learning how hard it is to say the same true thing over and over without it going hollow. Then she opened the folder. And the very first thing she said rearranged the entire room. Mr. Hayes, she began, did not leave a simple will. My father's expression didn't change yet. He was still in the part of the conversation where he assumed this was just lawyer speak for the will, but formal. Years ago, Diane continued, with my office's help, he placed the bulk of his assets into a revocable living trust. Upon his death, that trust became irrevocable. Most of the estate will pass under its terms, privately, outside of probate, exactly as he specified. My father's brow folded. I watched it happen in real time, like watching a building's foundation shift before the cracks become visible. This was not the script he had memorized. A will, he could have read in advance. Anticipated. Planned around, the way he'd planned around everything else his entire life. A trust was a locked door he hadn't even known existed. What does this mean? He said, and for the first time, the very first time in this entire story, there was an edge underneath his confidence, for the business. Diane looked at him, calm as still water. It means, she said, we follow Mr. Hayes's instructions, exactly as written. Outside, the first rain of the day began to tap against the window. I heard it before anyone else did. I think I'd been listening for it without realizing. It sounded exactly like the tin roof at the yard. Diane worked through the smaller parts of the trust first, slow, careful, the way you diffuse something delicate, piece by piece, making sure nothing went off before you were ready for it. There were keepsakes. My grandfather's tools, the good ones, the ones he'd had since before I was born, went to 2 old yard workers, named individually, by name, with a short note for each one that Diane read aloud in her steady voice. A college fund, already set up and funded, for the youngest grandchildren, a detail that made my mother's hand tighten on the table. A sum set aside for my mother. Generous. Clean. No strings, no conditions, nothing she had to do or be or prove to receive it. It made her cry, quietly, into a tissue one of the aunts handed her, in a way I hadn't expected, and honestly, didn't enjoy watching, because I think it was the first time in a long time she'd been given something without an unspoken expectation attached to it, and I think some part of her didn't know what to do with that. Dean received something too. His grandfather's old flatbed truck, the actual truck, the one from 1968, the one the entire business had been built on top of, still running, still sitting in the back lot under a tarp. And $10,000. I watched my brother's face do the math, in real time, the same way I'd watched my father's brow fold a few minutes earlier. He had walked in expecting, hoping, I think, more than he'd ever admit, that the trust would somehow refill the account he'd already drained. That Grandpa would quietly bail out the venture, the way Dad had funded it in the first place. That this was just how it worked, in this family. Someone always covered for the loud one, eventually. Instead, he got a 58-year-old truck and a sentence about hard work, read aloud by a stranger in a leather folder. He set his phone down on the table, face down, and for the first time in this entire story, for maybe the first time in his entire life, my brother had absolutely nothing to sell. My father sat very still. He was waiting for the only line that actually mattered to him. The controlling stake in Hayes Lumber and Supply. The thing his entire tower, the warehouse, the loan, the future he'd already spent, leaned on. Diane got to it slowly, and before she even read who received it, she read the condition my grandfather had attached. The room went so quiet I could hear the rain on the window, individual drops, the way you can hear individual notes in a piece of music once everything else falls away. The controlling interest, Diane read, her voice level, unhurried, is to pass to whichever heir, during my lifetime, built a business or fund of their own, and had it documented, in writing, with consideration, and a witness. She let that sentence sit in the air. She didn't rush to the next part. I think, and I've thought about this since, I think she'd done this before, too. Read a sentence like that to a room full of people and let them do the arithmetic themselves, because hearing someone else say the answer out loud lands differently than working it out yourself. And I watched it happen. I watched every head in that room do the same silent calculation. One by one, My mother first, then Dean, then, last and slowest, my father, and arrive, each of them, at the exact same impossible answer. My father's hands flattened against the table. Not a fist. Just, flat. Pressed down, like he was trying to hold the table itself in place. My mother turned, slowly, in her chair, and looked at me. And I understood, all at once, sitting there in my grey suit with my hands in my lap, what a single folded page, carried against my chest for 9 months, had been all along. Diane reached into the folder and drew out an envelope. My name was written across the front, in my grandfather's handwriting. The letters a little unsteady, slower than I remembered his handwriting being, even just a year ago, but unmistakably his. I recognized the way he made his N, the small flourish at the bottom that he'd done the same way for 60 years. She slid it down the length of the table toward me. It traveled past my father, who watched it go like it was something being taken from him, even though it had never been his to begin with. Past my mother, whose eyes followed it the whole way. Past Dean, who, for once, didn't reach for his phone. Every eye in that room followed that envelope across the table, like it was the last lifeboat off a ship that everyone had just realized was sinking. Mr. Hayes asked that you open this here, Diane said, gently, but with no room in her voice for argument. In front of everyone. My father found his voice. It came out lower than I expected, and harder. This is absurd, he said. She kept his books once. That doesn't make her. Diane raised one hand. Not unkindly. Just, finally. He stopped mid-sentence, because lawyers, in their own conference rooms, in moments like this, carry a quiet authority that even angry men recognize, somewhere underneath the anger. Mr. Hayes was very specific, Diane said. Please, Nora. The envelope sat in front of me on the table. I put my hand on it, and I swear, I could feel the entire year pressing up through the paper. The rented hall. The notebook with one word on the first page. The showbox. Sam Coleman's hat in his hands at the counter. The blue mug, washed and dried and set back in its place. The rain on the tin roof. The slow, steady scratch of an old man's signature on a single line. I looked up, once, before I opened it. My father was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Somewhere between fury and fear, but mostly, underneath all of it, fear. And he was right to be afraid. Just not of me. He was afraid of what his own father had quietly seen, and written, and signed, in the 1 year my father had spent looking at everything except his own father. The 1 year he'd spent counting $1 million he'd already given away, and an inheritance he'd already spent, and a tower he'd already built on a promise nobody had made. I slid my thumb under the flap. The room held its breath. So did I. Because whatever was inside, it had my grandfather's hand on it. And that meant it was going to be true. Inside the envelope were 2 things. A letter, and a single sheet of trust documentation. I read the official page first, because I'm my grandfather's granddaughter, and he taught me, without ever saying it directly, to read the terms before you let yourself feel the feelings. It confirmed everything Diane had begun to say. Under the trust, the controlling interest in Hayes Lumber and Supply passed to me, Nora, as the heir who had, during his lifetime, built and documented a fund of her own. The proof of that condition, named specifically, by document number, in the trust itself, was a 1-page term sheet, dated 9 months earlier, signed by Earl Hayes, by me, and by one witness, Samuel Coleman. That $40,000 hadn't only been a bet on me. It had been a key, cut months in advance, quietly, deliberately, to a door he already knew, even then, that I would one day have to walk through. He had also named me successor trustee over the business holdings, trusting me, in writing, with his name on it, to keep the books the way he always had. Then I read the letter. And that's where my composure finally cracked, quietly, the way mine always does. Not loudly. Just, a crack, small and clean. The kind that doesn't shatter anything, just lets something through. It was short. He wrote that he was sorry he wouldn't be there to see my face. He wrote that he had watched, that night in the rented hall, a man hand $1 million to the loud child, and a sentence to the steady one, and that he had decided, that very day, sitting at the back of that hall with his hands folded, not moving, that he was going to do something about it. The only way he knew how. The only way he ever trusted. With paper. And patience. And it ended with the line he'd been saying to me, in pieces, for an entire year, finished, at last, in his own unsteady handwriting. I'm not betting on the loud one. I'm betting on the one who showed up. You earned your name long before anyone gave you a dime. It was always yours, Nora. I just made it official. I put the letter down. And I let the tears come. 2 of them. Maybe 3. No more than that. Because I was still in a room full of people. And some things, even now, even after everything, I still carry alone. My father came apart in front of everyone he had spent his entire life performing for. It started low. And it climbed fast. He said it was a mistake. He said his father had been confused, senile, he actually used that word, in front of the man's own grandchildren, 3 weeks after the funeral. He said I had cornered a dying old man and tricked a signature out of him, taken advantage of a mind that wasn't what it used to be. His voice rose. It filled that small conference room, and spilled out into the hallway, loud enough that an assistant cracked the door open to check if everything was all right. My mother put a hand on his sleeve, and he shook it off, hard enough that her hand fell back into her lap, and she just sat there, looking at it. He swore he would fight it. Contest the trust. Drag it through every court in the county. Take it as far as it would go. Diane let him burn through the worst of it. She didn't interrupt. She let the whole thing run its course, the way you let a storm exhaust itself rather than trying to shout over it. Then, in the same level tone she'd used all morning, she spoke. The trust, she explained, had been established years earlier, years, not months, while Mr. Hayes was plainly, demonstrably competent. Reviewed. Witnessed. Documented at every single step, with medical assessments on file from his own physician, dated and signed, specifically because Mr. Hayes had anticipated exactly this kind of challenge and wanted to remove any doubt in advance. Contesting it, Diane said carefully, would be difficult. And costly. And in my experience, arrangements built this carefully tend to hold. She didn't say he had no case. Good lawyers never promise the weather. She just made it very clear, in that calm, level voice, that he'd be spending money he no longer had, money that, on paper, had never really been his to begin with, to chase a door that had been locked, deliberately, years before he'd even realized there was a door there at all. And that's when the real terror finally reached his face. Because my father wasn't just losing an argument in a conference room. He was losing the foundation his entire tower had been standing on. The loan. The warehouse. The inheritance he'd spent before it ever existed. All of it, every beam of it, had assumed this room would go the other way. And the longer he screamed, the smaller the screaming made him. Until the man who had stood in a rented hall a year ago, handing out $1 million to applause, looked like exactly what he was. A frightened heir who had never built a single thing in his life, watching the one builder in the family inherit the proof of it, in writing, with a witness, in front of everyone. I stood up. Not to shout him down. I've never won anything in my life by being the loudest, and I wasn't about to start now, in my grandfather's name, in a room with his letter still warm from my hands. I waited until the room went quiet, until even my father ran out of breath, and stood there, chest heaving, looking suddenly much older than he had 20 minutes earlier. Then I reached into my bag, and took out the single page I had carried against my chest since spring. I set it down on the table, gently, where everyone could see it, right next to my grandfather's letter. The term sheet. 3 signatures. A date. 9 months before he died. Months before he was anything but sharp. If anyone wants to say my grandfather didn't know what he was doing, I said, and I kept my voice as level as Diane's had been all morning, here's his hand. Steady. Last spring. Read it. Nobody moved to read it. They didn't have to. They could see it from where they sat, the steady line, the clear date, the 3 names. And they could see my father seeing it, too. Then I looked at him. My father. The man who had told me, in a rented hall, in front of 200 people, to go earn my own. You told me to go earn my own, I said. So I did. A pause, not for effect, just because I needed it. This is what my own looks like. I didn't gloat. I didn't list every way he'd failed me, every dismissal, every go earn your own repeated across a year like a verdict he kept handing down. I told the room, plainly, what would happen next, because someone had to keep the books, and that someone, as of this moment, was me. As successor trustee, I would keep Hayes Lumber open. I would make payroll, every Friday, on time, the way it always had been. The men in the yard, the ones whose names my grandfather had remembered for 60 years, would keep their jobs. I would sit down with the bank, honestly, and restructure the loan my father had built on a promise nobody made. Because putting him out on the street would help no one, it would cost the town jobs, and it would dishonor the man who had raised us both. And neither of those things was something I was willing to spend. And I would offer Dean a real position. Not a gift. A job, with actual hours, and actual targets, that he would actually have to meet. My brother looked up at that. And for the first time in this entire story, for the first time, maybe, in his entire life, he didn't have a single thing to say. In the quiet that followed, my mother said the thing that finally ended it. She wasn't talking to me. She wasn't talking to my father, or to Dean, or really to anyone in that room. She was looking at the term sheet on the table, and at the letter beside it, and she said it almost to herself, quiet, the way you'd say something you just realized was true, even though you'd known the words for it your whole life. She carries the name now. A year earlier, on a back porch, in the cold, she had told me Dean carried the name, and I just had it. Now she had watched her own father-in-law put it in writing, in front of a lawyer, with a witness, months in advance, exactly which child had earned it. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that, because this is the moment a softer story would give me, the tearful reconciliation, the mother who finally says all the things she should have said years ago. I didn't get one. My mother saw the truth in that room, clearly, for the first time in her life. But seeing isn't the same as changing. And she went home that day, still married to the man who had shamed me in a rented hall. Still the mother who had smiled into her wine while it happened. The only difference now was that she could no longer pretend she didn't know. I gathered the letter and the term sheet, slid them carefully back into the envelope, and stood up. My father was still talking, lower now, almost muttering, to my mother, to the aunts, to anyone who would hold on to his version of the morning a little longer. I heard fragments of it as I walked toward the door. Manipulated. Confused. We'll see about this. I didn't answer any of it. You don't have to win an argument you've already settled on paper. I told Diane I'd call her office in the morning to begin the work. She nodded, and for just a moment, something in her professional neutrality softened, not quite a smile, but close to it. I walked out of that conference room, down the hallway, past the assistant who'd cracked the door earlier, and out the front door, into the weather. The rain had passed while I wasn't looking. The pavement was wet and shining under a sky that had cracked open into a thin, cold light. The kind of light that comes right after a storm, when everything looks a little too clean, a little too clear, like the world has just been rinsed. I got in my car, but I didn't drive home. I drove out to the yard. I let myself in with the key my grandfather had pressed into my hand on his last good day, the one he'd told me to use, when the rain came through the roof. I stood inside, in the smell of sawdust and cut pine and machine oil, in the building my grandfather had started with one truck, back in 1968. The building that now, in some real and legal sense, in writing, witnessed, documented, was mine to protect. The blue mug sat on the counter, exactly where it always sat today. Exactly where I'd washed it and set it back, the night after the funeral. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, the worn enamel, the chip on the rim that had been there as long as I could remember, the handle worn down to bare metal from 60 years of the same grip. Then I set it back down again, in its place. Because some things, you don't move. You just keep them close, exactly where they belong, and you let them stay that way. The last of the rain dripped off the tin roof in a slow, steady rhythm, like a ledger, finally, after a very long year, balancing. I had earned my own, and he had seen me do it. The weeks that followed were not dramatic, and I'm grateful for that. Drama is what got us here in the first place. Drama is expensive, in every sense of the word, and I'd had enough of it for one lifetime. I kept Hayes Lumber open. I made payroll, that first Friday, and every Friday after. The same routine, the same handshakes, the same men who'd shown up for my grandfather's funeral now showing up, every week, to be paid by his granddaughter. I sat down with the bank, the same bank that had, a year earlier, wanted assurances from a man who'd never had the right to give them, and we laid the books bare. We restructured my father's loan into something honest. Slower. Survivable. I didn't crush him. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy, and because some part of me, in the weeks right after the reading, was tempted to. But crushing him would have cost the town its jobs. And it would have cost me my grandfather's good name. Neither of those was for sale, not even for the satisfaction of it. I folded Hayes Ventures into the business, too, so the fund kept doing what it had always done, backing the Sam Colemans of this county, the shops nobody else would pick up the phone for. Dean took the job I offered him. The first month nearly broke his pride. He had to clock in, an actual time clock, the old-fashioned kind, the one that had been bolted to the wall of the yard office since before either of us were born. He had to learn the inventory system. He had to answer to a schedule, like everyone else, for the first time in his life. But somewhere in the second month, something shifted. I noticed it before he did, I think. He stopped performing. And he started working. More than once, I caught him doing something right, restocking a section properly, double-checking an order before it went out, just to do it right, with absolutely no one watching. No applause waiting for him. No audience. I let myself hope. A little. Carefully. The way you let yourself hope about things that have disappointed you before. My father never thanked me for saving the business. And I never asked him to. We speak now in the language of business, the only language we have ever shared honestly, the only one neither of us has ever lied in. It's not warmth. I want to be honest about that too. It's not nothing, either. There was one last conversation I had, on my own terms, a few months after the reading. I went to the family house, not summoned this time. I drove myself there, on a Sunday afternoon I chose, and I said what I needed to say, to both of my parents, at the same time, in the kitchen, standing up, because I didn't plan to stay long. I told them I wasn't looking for an apology. I had stopped needing one somewhere around my second signed client, more than a year ago now, somewhere in a stack of folders on my kitchen table, late at night, long before any of this had a name. What I needed, going forward, was simple. And I wasn't going to bend on it. Honest dealing. Clean books. And to be treated, in every room, in every decision, from this point forward, as exactly what I had already proven myself to be. My mother nodded. Small. Quiet. Pulling her cardigan tight again, the way she always did, even indoors, even in a warm kitchen. My father didn't nod. But he didn't argue, either. And from him, from a man who had spent 31 years never once admitting he was wrong about anything, that silence was its own kind of signature. I'm not asking you to be sorry, I told them, at the door, on my way out. I'm asking you to deal with me straight. That's all I ever asked. That's all I ever wanted. Then I drove home, across town, to my own apartment, to my own quiet, to the life I had built with my own two hands, one folder at a time. Here's what that year taught me. And it's the only lesson I'll ever ask you to take from this. A name that's given to you can always be taken back. With 4 words, in a rented hall, in front of 200 people, if someone decides to. But a name you earn, with your own 2 hands, with a notebook and a showbox and a stack of dated, signed, witnessed agreements, is yours. For good. And no announcement, in any rented hall, by anyone, can ever call it back. If anyone has ever told you to go earn your own, I'd ask you not to hear it as a dismissal. Hear it as a dare. And then, quietly, patiently, one folder at a time, go do exactly that. By the way, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments, because it's amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.